The shadow in the wilderness. Do you dare to accept it? Imagine seeking solitude in the vast, untouched wilderness, only to discover that you are not as alone as you think. On a solo camping trip deep in the forests of northern Minnesota, I set out to find peace and connection with nature. But as night fell and the forest grew still, something moved in the darkness, something I couldn't explain, something that watched me from the shadows. Join me on a journey through the unknown, where fear lurks in every rustling leaf, and the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Are you ready to face the shadows that hide just beyond the light? If you enjoy tales of mystery and suspense, don't forget to subscribe to MR.Quentin for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an how. 2 years ago, on a crisp, late spring night, I made the decision to challenge myself in a way I never had before. I set out on a solo camping trip to a remote lake in northern Minnesota, a place I had visited before with friends but had never truly experienced alone. Nestled deep in the wilderness, the lake was surrounded by towering pines, rocky shores, and the kind of serene beauty that felt untouched by time. It was the perfect place to disconnect from the world and immerse myself in nature. This trip was more than just a getaway. It was a personal challenge. I had always enjoyed camping, but I had never done it alone. There was something both thrilling and intimidating about being out in the wild with no one else to rely on. I wanted to test my ability to handle solitude, to navigate the unpredictability of nature, and to see if I could find peace in the quiet. I imagined nights by the campfire, the sound of loons echoing over the still water, and the simple satisfaction of waking up to the first light of dawn without the distractions of modern life. As I packed my gear and mapped out my route, excitement and nerves mingled in equal measure. I knew this trip would push me beyond my comfort zone, but that was exactly what I wanted. I was ready to embrace the unknown, to listen to the whispers of the forest, and to see what lessons solitude had to offer. As the sun dipped below the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I finished setting up my tent at the edge of the woods, just a short distance from the lake. The air had cooled significantly since the afternoon, carrying with it the crisp, earthy scent of pine and damp soil. My small clearing was surrounded by towering trees, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like ancient sentinels. In the fading light, the lake shimmered, a vast, glassy expanse that reflected the soft hues of twilight. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet strangely unsettling. With my camp securely in place, I turned my attention to building a fire. The process was routine, something I had done countless times before, yet in the solitude of the wilderness, even simple tasks carried a weight of importance. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering orange light onto the trunks of nearby trees. Sparks drifted upward, momentarily illuminating the canopy before fading into the encroaching darkness. I sat on a log near the fire, stretching my legs and taking in the stillness around me. The only sounds were the rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore and the distant call of a loon echoing across the lake. It was the kind of quiet I had longed for, yet now that I had it, something about it felt off. There was an unease creeping into my bones, a faint but persistent sensation that I was not entirely alone. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by endless wilderness. It was natural to feel a little on edge. Still, I found myself glancing toward the darkness beyond the fire's glow, as if expecting to catch movement between the trees. Nothing. Just the dense forest stretching endlessly in every direction, the underbrush rustling occasionally in the wind. Yet the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my awareness. I took a deep breath and turned my attention back to the fire, trying to focus on its warmth. Solitude, I reminded myself, was what I had come here for. I had wanted to escape the noise of everyday life, to disconnect, to challenge myself. And yet, now that I was here, sitting in the middle of the vast unknown, I couldn't shake the unsettling sense that something, some unseen presence, was watching me from the darkness. The rational part of me dismissed the idea outright. It was just my mind adjusting to the unfamiliar silence, filling in the gaps with irrational fears. But deep down, in a more primal part of myself, I wasn't so sure. The wind picked up slightly, causing the trees to sway and whisper against one another. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and poked at the fire absently, watching embers rise into the night sky. I told myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. Yet my instincts screamed otherwise. Then, something changed. A sudden shift in the atmosphere, a subtle, almost imperceptible alteration in the air around me. The fire crackled, the lake lapped against the shore, the wind rustled the trees. But underneath it all, I sensed something else, a presence. I turned my head sharply, scanning the tree line. My breath hitched. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the fire's reach. My pulse quickened. I leaned forward slightly, straining my eyes, but the darkness remained impenetrable. Had I really seen something? Or was it just my imagination running wild? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. This was exactly the kind of fear that came with being alone in the wild. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf could be amplified into something sinister when there was no one else around to confirm or deny it. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing unease prickling at the back of my neck. I stood up slowly, my ears straining for any sound beyond the natural rhythm of the night. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows along the ground. My heartbeat pounded in my chest. Was it an animal, a deer, a coyote, or was it something else entirely? The thought sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, I debated retreating into my tent, zipping myself inside where I could at least pretend I was safe. But that felt foolish. If something was truly out there, a thin layer of nylon wouldn't protect me. Instead, I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay put. This was my challenge, my journey into solitude. I wasn't going to let irrational fear ruin it. Yet, as I sat back down by the fire, my back to the vast darkness of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone, and that perhaps I never had been. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it tends to in unfamiliar places. The forest at night has a way of making even the smallest sounds seem unnerving. The wind rustling through the trees could be mistaken for whispers. The soft splash of a fish breaking the water's surface could sound like footsteps, and the shifting shadows, cast by the flickering fire, could make a person see things that weren't really there. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, on the rhythmic chirping of crickets, on the way the lake reflected the sliver of moon hanging in the sky. I told myself I was safe, that there was no reason to feel this growing unease gnawing at the back of my mind. But then I heard it, a sharp, dry crack, unmistakable, the sound of something heavy snapping a large branch deep within the trees in front of me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I sat frozen, my body tensed, my senses suddenly razor-sharp. This wasn't the random creak of shifting trees in the wind or the distant rustle of a small animal darting through the underbrush. This was deliberate, heavy. Something, or someone, had stepped on a large branch and broken it clean in two. My pulse thundered in my ears as adrenaline flooded my system. I reached for my flashlight with slightly trembling fingers, my mind racing through possibilities. A deer? A bear? A person? Each option carried its own weight of fear, but it was the last one that unsettled me the most. I clicked the flashlight on and aimed it toward the source of the sound. A bright beam of white sliced through the darkness, illuminating the dense tree line. The underbrush was thick, tangled with ferns and fallen branches, but beyond that, I could make out the dark silhouettes of trees stretching into the distance. I swept the beam back and forth, my breath shallow, my grip tightening on the flashlight. Nothing. The forest remained still, unmoving, yet the air around me felt charged, like the eerie silence before a storm. I scanned the trees again, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. The logical part of me wanted to believe that whatever had made the sound had already moved on, but something deeper, something instinctual, told me that wasn't true. I strained my ears, listening. The fire crackled softly behind me. The lake lapped at the shore. And then, silence. Not the usual quiet of the wilderness, filled with distant nocturnal sounds. This was an unnatural silence, the kind that makes every hair on your body stand on end. The kind that tells you something is very, very wrong. My heart pounded against my ribs as I slowly lowered the flashlight, my fingers gripping it like a lifeline. I considered my options. Should I call out? Try to scare off whatever was out there? Or would that only confirm my presence to something that was already watching? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step back toward the fire, instinctively wanting to stay within its glow. Fire meant safety, visibility, warmth, but even as I stood there, bathed in its flickering light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching unbearably long. I kept the flashlight in my hand, scanning the trees every so often, but the forest remained still. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down, though I kept my back to the fire, unwilling to face the black expanse of the woods without some form of protection. I told myself it was fine, that it was just an animal passing through, that there was no reason to be afraid. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I stayed up for hours, unable to shake the unsettling sensation that something was lurking just beyond my line of sight. I listened intently for any further sounds, any hint that whatever had broken that branch was still nearby. But the only thing that greeted me was the eerie quiet of the forest. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, weighing down my limbs and dulling my senses. I didn't want to sleep, but I knew I needed to. My body ached from the tension, from sitting so rigidly for so long. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But even as I climbed into my tent, zipping it shut with shaking fingers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, and that it was waiting. The unsettling silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Despite my efforts to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, the oppressive stillness of the night continued to gnaw at me. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a brief comfort in the face of the unknown. The forest beyond, though bathed in darkness, seemed to press in on me, its depth and mystery growing by the minute. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, felt amplified, carrying an undercurrent of tension that refused to dissipate. I tried to focus on the flickering flames, the comforting glow, but my eyes kept darting toward the tree line, as though someone was out there, hidden just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't just my imagination. I was sure of it now. Something was lurking in the shadows, watching me. Then, I heard it again. A faint rustling, soft but distinct, from the woods. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a small animal moving through the underbrush. This was something deliberate, purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on once more. The beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the trees and bushes in front of me. I moved it slowly, methodically, my breath shallow as I tried to calm the panic rising in my chest. At first, there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the woods, the gnarled trunks of trees standing tall in the darkness. But then, as the light shifted along the outer edge of the illuminated area, my pulse froze. There, standing just at the edge of the beam's reach, was a figure. It was tall, unnervingly so. The silhouette loomed in the shadows, standing completely still, as though it had been there the entire time, waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat, and my hand shook as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, unsure whether to call out or retreat. The figure was so still, so perfectly motionless, that I almost questioned whether my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, I could see it clearly now. The shape of a person, tall and broad-shouldered, standing just outside the light. The body was lean, muscular, like someone who spent their life outdoors. His height was striking. He seemed to be nearly 2 meters tall, towering over the surrounding trees. His features were obscured by the darkness, but the sheer presence of him sent an icy wave of fear washing over me. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world around me, the crackling fire, the distant sound of the lake, faded into the background. All that existed was the figure standing just beyond the light, his gaze unreadable, fixed somewhere in the direction of my trembling form. I wanted to speak, to shout, but my throat had gone dry. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to retreat into the safety of my tent, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. And then, to my horror, the figure moved. It wasn't fast, but the motion was deliberate. Slowly, the figure took a single step back, as though acknowledging my presence, but without a word, without a sound. His eyes, if he had any, remained hidden in the shadows. His face was just a dark, indistinct blur, and yet I felt it, the overwhelming sense that he was aware of me, studying me from the darkened depths of the forest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out, demand to know who he was, what he wanted? Or was it better to keep silent, to play along, pretending I hadn't seen him, hoping he would just leave? But before I could make any decision, the figure took another step back, vanishing into the thickening shadows with a smooth, almost graceful movement. One moment he was there, and the next, the forest swallowed him whole. I was left staring into the darkness, my flashlight trembling in my hand. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck, and my heart raced in my chest. What had I just seen? Who was that? There were no answers, only the oppressive silence of the forest, now heavier than ever. The world around me felt suffocating, as though the trees themselves had leaned closer, closing me in, wrapping me in an invisible grip. I quickly turned my flashlight toward the spot where the figure had stood, hoping to see some sign, any sign of his presence. But there was nothing, just the quiet, undisturbed forest, no footprints, no broken branches, no trace of movement. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had seen him. I had felt his presence. But now, standing alone in the vast, silent woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had never truly been human. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to pack up, to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But I had come here for solitude, for peace, for a challenge. I couldn't just let my fears control me. I had to be brave. I had to stay. But as I sat back down by the fire, my mind racing, I couldn't shake the one thought that kept circling in my head. Whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting, and I was alone. I stood frozen in the dim glow of my flashlight, the blood draining from my face as my mind raced to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The tall figure, the shadow, had vanished into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared, but the fear it left in its wake was undeniable. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. For a long moment, I just stood there, unwilling to move, unwilling to accept that something so unnatural had just happened. The forest around me had returned to its eerie silence, as though the world had gone back to its quiet routine, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That figure, That tall, silent presence watching me from the trees had left an imprint on my mind that I couldn't ignore. I could feel it lingering, like a shadow in the corners of my mind. My first instinct was to dismiss it, to convince myself it was just the product of an overactive imagination, perhaps a trick of the light, a distorted shape conjured by the flickering fire. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. The figure had been real. It had been tangible. I had seen it with my own eyes. And worse, its presence had felt intentional. The more I thought about it, the more my body reacted. My heart began to race again, but this time with a new urgency. I could no longer sit idly by, pretending that nothing was wrong. My pulse quickened, a mix of dread and desperation surging through me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey in the vast, dark wilderness. Without warning, I snapped into action. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave, to get out, to put as much distance between myself and whatever it was that had been watching me. I didn't think about it, didn't hesitate. I grabbed my backpack and hastily shoved everything I could into it. Clothes, food, my tent, anything that was essential, anything that would allow me to leave. I tossed aside the things I didn't need, unnecessary gear, my camping stove, my sleeping bag. There was no time for comfort or niceties now. I needed to move. My hands were shaking as I struggled to zip up the bag, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear that had taken root in my chest now turned into a cold, gnawing certainty that I had to leave this place, now. Every second I spent lingering felt like a second too long. I glanced toward the edge of the clearing, the shadows of the trees looming just beyond the reach of my firelight. The forest had become a place of darkness and uncertainty, a place where things moved in the hidden corners of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that those dark woods were alive with something far older and more dangerous than anything I had ever encountered. The figure I had seen, no matter how fleeting or silent, had only confirmed that there was something out there, something far beyond what I could understand. With a swift motion, I slung my bag over my shoulder, gripping the straps tightly as I made my way toward the path that led out of the clearing. My flashlight trembled in my other hand, casting erratic beams of light as I moved. Each step felt heavier than the last, my senses on high alert, my eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. In fact, it had grown stronger, more oppressive, like a weight on my shoulders. I didn't run, not yet, but I moved quickly, my legs carrying me as fast as I could without stumbling over the uneven forest floor. My breath came in short gasps, the cold air stinging my lungs as I pushed forward. The further I walked from the camp, the more my heartbeat slowed, but the fear remained, a constant undercurrent of tension that I couldn't shake. I tightened my grip on the bear spray I had brought with me. The canister felt oddly comforting, though I knew in my gut that it wasn't going to be much use against whatever was lurking in the dark. The forest was too vast, too unpredictable. A spray of pepper could stop a curious bear, but it wouldn't do much against whatever that figure had been. The more I thought about it, the more the edges of my fear seemed to blur. Had it been human? Animal? Something else entirely? My mind was a whirl of questions, but I pushed them aside, focusing only on the path ahead. I kept my eyes fixed on the narrow trail that snaked through the trees, guiding me away from the campsite, away from the danger I felt so strongly lurking just behind me. The farther I got from the camp, the more I felt the grip of panic ease, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. It was as though the entire forest had come alive, reacting to my fear. The trees began to thin as I made my way down the path, and I finally allowed myself to take a deep breath. The fear was still there, but I could feel the tension in my chest start to release as the sounds of the forest returned to their natural. The faint chirping of crickets, the distant call of an owl, All the small sounds that I had tuned out earlier now filled my ears like a welcome return to normalcy. I was leaving. I was getting away from the thing that had stalked the edges of my mind, and I was beginning to feel, however fleetingly, that I might be safe. But I didn't stop. I didn't dare. My pace remained swift, each step taking me further from the camp, further from the shadow that had haunted me. The night was still deep and vast, and I knew that no matter how far I walked, I would never fully escape the memory of what I had seen. But for now, it was enough to know I had made the decision to leave, to run, to live. And as I walked into the unknown, the forest swallowed the sound of my footsteps. As I made my way down the narrow path, the trees closing in around me, I could feel the weight of the night pressing against me with every step. The further I walked from the camp, the more I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that whatever had been lurking in the darkness was long gone. Yet no matter how far I got, the gnawing sense of being followed never left me. I didn't dare glance over my shoulder. Every part of me screamed to keep moving forward, to not acknowledge the possibility that something, or someone, was still out there, trailing behind me in the shadows. But deep inside, I knew the truth. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a cold certainty that made my skin prickle. The figure I had seen was still watching me. It was still there, somewhere just beyond the trees, following my every move. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, suffocating, and it only grew stronger as I walked. My mind raced with a million thoughts, questions I had no answers to. Was it human? Was it some wild creature that had become curious? Or was it something else entirely, something ancient, existing in the space between the known and the unknown? I tried to suppress these thoughts, to focus on the path ahead of me, but every rustle in the underbrush made my heart leap into my throat. Every crack of a branch, every shifting shadow had me flinching and glancing nervously behind me, as if expecting to see the tall figure standing just out of reach of my flashlight. I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like an invisible presence, lingering just behind me, watching. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, whether I had walked a few miles or only a few steps. The world around me felt distant, surreal. My own footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the thick air of the forest. It was as if the woods had become something else, something unfathomable, filled with eyes that I couldn't see. But the worst part wasn't the rustling in the trees, or the unease creeping along the back of my neck. It wasn't even the fear that had wrapped itself around my chest, like a vice. No. The worst part was the undeniable feeling that I was not just being watched, but hunted. That whatever had been observing me in the darkness, whatever had stepped back into the shadows after I had seen it, was still out there. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't gone back to wherever it had come from. It had followed me. I kept walking, faster now, the weight of the backpack pressing down on me like a constant reminder that I was still out here, alone, in the heart of the forest. My breath came in shallow bursts, my legs aching, but I didn't dare stop. I couldn't. If I stopped, I would give it a chance to catch up. If I looked back, I would acknowledge that whatever had been following me might still be there, just out of sight. Eventually, I reached the clearing where my car was parked, and the moment I saw the headlights in the distance, I felt a rush of relief. The car meant safety. It meant that I was almost out of the woods, both literally and figuratively. But even then, that eerie feeling didn't fade. It clung to me, a shadow that refused to dissipate, like a cold fog that wouldn't lift. I glanced nervously at the trees one last time before I reached the car, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the shadows, but the clearing remained still, empty. I threw my gear into the back of the car, locked the doors, and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between myself and that forsaken campsite as possible. As I drove away, the weight on my chest lifted slightly, but the unease never quite left. The feeling of being watched lingered, a constant companion in the back of my mind. It was as though the figure, or whatever it had been, had followed me in a way I couldn't fully understand. I couldn't explain why, but I felt it in every beat of my heart. From that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed when I was alone in the wilderness. What had started as an exhilarating challenge to spend time alone in nature had turned into a lingering fear that I could never quite escape. The peace I had once found in solitude now felt distant, foreign. I had become hyper-aware of every movement in the trees, every change in the wind, every rustle in the bushes. The woods, once my sanctuary, had become a place of unknown dangers, a place where I was never truly alone. I tried to go back a few times to convince myself that I could reclaim that sense of peace, that sense of connection with nature. But every time I set foot in the forest, the memories of that night, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, came rushing back, overwhelming me. It was as if the forest itself held a dark secret, one that I had glimpsed but could never fully comprehend. And so, I stopped going. I stopped venturing into the wilderness alone, stopped seeking the solitude I had once craved. The woods had changed for me, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, that unshakable feeling of being followed, of being watched by something unknown, was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. It was a feeling I would never be able to outrun, and from that night on, the wilderness would never be the same.